Before we start the session with 5 excellent speakers, the rules are the same. First 5 presentations, and then we have room for a Q&A. And I also want to help you to remind you to vote on your poster. Please do it with the app. Vote your 3 favorite posters. And tomorrow there will be the announcement of the 3 winners. So now I want to give the floor to Andreas Ravage. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andreas Ravage. I'm a postdoc researcher at the French Natural Museum of Natural History in Paris. And I will present you today the first result from the APOCOP project, with the main focus on the drivers of bat fatality and the efficiency of curtailment measures at onshore wind farms. So, as you might know, after a few days of this conference, wind energy production is not without its environmental drawbacks on biodiversity. And this is why the objectives of APOCOP were to create a database of mortality surveys collected from standardized data in order to provide robust estimates of mortality to understand the drivers of bats and bird mortality. So in France, we have the chance to have a national protocol which regulates the collection of mortality on wind farms since 2018. And it ensures that we have a standardized data that we collected from these reports. And it enables large-scale studies to identify the drivers of mortality. So, despite the existence of a robust field protocol, the observed mortality is always a small fraction of the actual mortality caused by the wind turbines. And so that's why we use estimators to approximate as much as possible the actual mortality. So let's take an example to illustrate that. Imagine you have 7 individuals that collided with the blade since the last survey on this turbine. Unfortunately, one of the carcasses fell outside the regulatory survey area, so you didn't observe it. 3 carcasses fell in inaccessible areas, like here in the forest, for example. 1 carcass was scavenged or displaced by a predator. And by miss of luck, you miss one of the carcasses once you go on the field to count them. So as a result, only 1 carcass out of 7 was found during this survey. So in order to approximate the real number of carcasses that collided with the blade, you need to divide this number of carcasses by the overall detection probability, which is a product of all the uncertainties I mentioned earlier, and that are approximated through field experiments. So here the more complete formula describing this parameter. And it has been developed by the US Geological Survey a few years ago, and incorporated in 2 different packages, GNS and evidence of absence, which allow to obtain mortality estimates and within a confidence interval or directly on the distribution of mortality estimates. So that's the 2 packages we use to estimate mortality for bats. And we did it separately for 3 guilds of bats that we determined through their echolocating abilities, which provide information on their movement patterns, the habitat they use, or their flight aids. In order to understand what are the factors that impact mortality, we first define buffer zone of variable size around each of the turbines, ranging from 100 to 5,000 meters. And within each of these buffers, we determine the habitats inside of them using land cover layers. So, for example, we define the forest cover, hedgerow density, and we also considered variables such as altitude and distance to coast. We also consider wind farm variables such as the rotor diameter, the ground clearance, and the age of the park. So, with all these variables, we constructed some models. But as a response variable, which is the estimated mortality, itself comes from a modeling procedure. You have to incorporate the uncertainty inside this variable. And so to do that, we use a bootstrap regression that I can explain later if you have some questions. And we did the separated model for all the guilds I mentioned, with all the covariates mentioned as explanatory variables in interaction with the curtailment measures on the park. So in this project, we analyzed more than 1,000 reports that were collected in France. Roughly half of them were usable, so that's the green points on this map. And it represents more than 90,000 searches at 350 wind farms, during which more than 2,400 carcasses of bats were observed. So if you take a look at the result now, you can see here the histogram depicting the distribution of the mortality estimates separated by guilds. And first thing you can see that there's a strong heterogeneity among parks. And you can see on the right side of these figures a few parks that concentrate a lot of mortality compared to others. And second thing you can see on these figures is that there is strong heterogeneity between guilds also, with most of the mortality representing by the medium-range ecolocators guilds, so mostly Pipistrellus. So let's take a look at the result now. So you will see this kind of figures. So this on the left side, you have the estimate from our models, from our bootstrap regression. So all the variables which are on the right side of this red line represent the variables that increases mortality, while on the left side, at the opposite, they decrease. An increase in their value means a decrease in mortality predicted by our model. If the line crosses the red line, it means we can't conclude to a significant effect of these variables. On the right side, you have the prediction for our models in two cases. So you have the predicted mortality in the case in red if the park wasn't curtailed, and in green when it was curtailed. One of the most important results from our study is right here in front of your eyes. That's an increase in forest cover across all models consistently emerges as the primary driver of increased mortality. At the opposite, higher proportion of open natural areas is correlated with, associated with a lower mortality risk for the medium-range ecolocators guild. Now, if we take a look at the wind farm characteristic, we can see here that a larger diameter, which is highly correlated with higher turbines, is associated with higher mortality risks. So the larger your turbines, the more mortality we'll have. This has great importance for the repowering of the parks. And on the opposite, you can see that the higher ground clearance is associated with a lower mortality. Another interesting result is that all the wind farms show lower fatality rates. So there is three possible hypotheses. The first is that there is an habituation of the individuals that learn to avoid the wind turbines. Second, it could be a local decline in population around the older turbines due to the past mortality. And third, it could be that older turbines are more subject to shutdowns, which translates in less mortality. What we saw here on the right side, on the right graph, is that every time it seems to have a lower mortality, and there is a significant interaction effect of the curtailment. But the right way to test it is not this way to do. That's why we conducted a before-after control impact, where we compare the mortality before and after the implementation of curtailment measure, as you can see on the right graph, and we compare it to the closest park, that were not curtailed but followed on the same years. And what you can see is that there is a strong and significant impact of the curtailment implementation. And the mean decrease we calculated was around 87% after the implementation. So if you now take a quick look at the long-range ecolocator guilds, we find some very similar results, except there are fewer significant variables, and some which make sense, like the ground clearance, which does not affect these guilds, which fly at higher heights. We conducted the same before-after control impact procedure for this group of species, and we find some significant decrease and with comparable results. So finally, what are the key messages to take away from home? We saw that short-range ecolocators are rarely affected by direct collision, but as shown by many studies, their activity is disturbed by turbines. We saw that mid-range echolocator species account for the highest number of fatalities. But given the smaller populations, we can expect a strong impact on these populations too. We provide some information that can allow recommendations for the micro-siting of the future wind farm, like to avoid to locate them near forest or water bodies, and to prefer open landscape and preferably already degrade like not non-profitable habitats. And we also show that lower ground clearance and larger turbines further increase the collision risk. So this has some powerful importance for the repowering of the park, which plan to replace fewer smaller turbines with taller one. But then you have to take into account that will increase the collision risk. So it's not only linked to the number of turbines you have. And finally, to conclude, we saw that acoustic activity-based curtailment effectively reduces mortality risk, despite not eliminating it entirely. So still half of the French park is not curtailed, so what do we wait to apply these effective measures? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Well in time and very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Kristen Liptrop will tell the next very interesting story. Please come to the stage, Kristen.
Great, thank you, Sistka, and good afternoon, everyone. You've already heard mention of Clocainnog Forest Wind Farm this morning at the plenary session, and today I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the story of ecological restoration at this wind farm. So I have to ask you to change gears slightly, please, as we demonstrate how we took a lot of the theory, best practice, and industry guidance to translate it into action on the ground for biodiversity at this wind farm. So we use the mantra, teamwork makes the dream work, throughout this process, because at the beginning, we had a lot of our stakeholders suggest that what we had committed to was overambitious for nature, for biodiversity. But it has been something we're really quite proud of, and I use the term teamwork here quite inclusively to even include these friendly ladies who have done a lot of the hard work for us at the wind farm. So just a little bit, although Umberto discussed our biodiversity actions and strategy this morning during the plenary, my role as biodiversity and ecology manager is to ensure that what we commit to during the planning stage is indeed implemented during operations. So I'm based in Inverness, Scotland, but cover the UK and Ireland, and Clocainnog there in the Yellow Stars in North Wales. So a little bit about the wind farm. It's a very, very busy site. It straddles two local planning authorities, so we have to do everything twice, really, through the planning system. And it's on land owned by the Welsh Government, but managed by Natural Resources Wales. So NRW acts as both our landowner and our statutory nature consultee, which is an interesting dynamic to balance by times. But primarily the forest, which is about 6,000 hectares, is commercial forestry. So it's a lot of Sitka spruce, wall-to-wall Sitka spruce, low value to biodiversity to start with. There's a lot of activity, a lot of recreation. We often have car rallies going through the sites with tens of thousands of spectators, bicycle events, hiking events, illegal raves quite regularly on the site, which are a challenge, and also conservation. So NRW have their own program of conservation for us to fit around. We received consent in September 2014 and carried out construction from March 2018 to September 2019. So we have, through the planning consent, the commitment to develop and implement a habitat management plan, which is a live iterative document for the 25 years of the wind farm. And the overall aim, or I'd like to say dream, and mind you, I should mention this was before the onset of nature positive or net gain or biodiversity net gain in the UK, was the implementation of measures that have nature conservation benefit but complement existing efforts within the forest. So we started on this journey in March 2020, just as we went into lockdown. So that was another interesting challenge to the story. But you can see on the image there, it's a long linear site, and all those colored areas, numbered areas, are the areas that we lease separately for nature conservation. And in most cases, they're slightly offset from the wind turbines themselves. And we have 6 key receptors there identified specifically within our HMP. So I'll start with heathlands, and I've included the excerpt from the HMP directly on each one of these receptor slides, if you want to have a look at that and the reason for choosing these habitats or species. But so far, we've restored about 130 hectares of this open habitat in the wind farm. And this actually was reigniting 2 previously existing projects, one by the RSPB and one by the local authorities, to try to open up the forest and provide connectivity for a lot of open species, reptiles, birds, mammals, small mammals, amphibians, that use those habitats, but that the forest otherwise created a bit of a barrier effect. So before and after, really, according to NRW's Forest Resource Plan, this should have been open ground all along, but we've had the challenge to clear that again, clear the natural regen, and open it up again for the species that use this habitat. Peatland restoration, you heard about that during the plenary as well, so I won't go into detail, but essentially a small area, but a very important area of about 20 hectares that we have converted and re-wetted back to peatland that will act as a carbon sink rather than a carbon source. So that's meant removing the regen, blocking ditches, and getting this area functioning again as it should have before it was afforested. Woodlands, this is a really nice feature of the story that was unexpected. It wasn't a feature of the HMP to start with, but as we started to work away and we looked at this area, this is compartment 8, it was meant to be a heathland, and we looked at it, we said, why would we take out this lovely broadleaf woodland? There's very, very small isolated pockets in the forest. So we've adopted this, we have lots of mountain ash and silver birch. And when we took these youngsters out to site to be part of our teamwork to try to inspire the next generation on how biodiversity and wind energy sit on the same side of the coin, that area you can see behind them was alive with birdsong that we don't really hear elsewhere in the forest. So it's been a really positive aspect of our work here. Species monitoring, black grouse, as you'll remember, is one of the receptors for the site. Sadly, before we even started building, the local population had already commenced a decline. That has continued, and we have never had them really within the wind farm footprint itself, but we've stuck with our monitoring to see if our habitat enhancement work may benefit the species. And recently, RSPB have reignited their project to look at whether or not that local population is viable if they get a bit of a helping hand with some habitat enhancement work. So we're working closely with RSPB to see if there's any more that we can do to help this iconic edge species. Nightjar, every May we look forward to having these guys come back from Africa to visit us in North Wales. We see 2 of the youngsters there this year in the middle, very well camouflaged, and they're doing really well. So there was a lot of concern that the whooshing of the turbines would possibly mask the chirring of the males to attract mates during the breeding season, but they've done really well, and in several years they've done better within the wind farm footprint than with beyond the wind farm footprint, and have nested right on the hard standing, right adjacent to the tracks. And a real positive for us is even though we're just recently having completed our restoration program, we finished it in February, and then that May we had a female, the yellow circle on the bottom, plunked down, because they don't really build a nest, they just lay their eggs anywhere, but use one of those recently restored restoration areas. And we're really hoping in the coming years to see more of that. Dormice, when we went to build the wind farm, everybody said there's no dormice in Clochainog Forest. Well, lo and behold, we put out some nest boxes and there were lots of dormice. There were dormice everywhere. So this opened up a lot of opportunities for us to use that population for some work for the species in general. So first we had to answer the question, did construction or operation of the wind farm affect dormice? No, it hasn't. They're doing very well. If anything, they're expanding. And also that led on to some additional work in that we initiated, set up, and funded a PhD with the University of Exeter, which Dr. Charlotte Armitage has recently defended. She's done some really interesting work that's contributing to conservation of the species generally. And it's really quite neat to think that this wind farm has given the opportunity for species conservation on a wider scale. So she's also shown that they do forage in conifer plantations, which no one thought was possible. And it's led to more work, such as these friendly guys in the middle, who are now visiting site to see if dogs can be trained to find torpid and hibernating dormice, which will be a huge advancement for their monitoring. Just a note on red squirrel support. There's a really active group, the Clocainag Red Squirrel Trust in the forest. We partner with them too, and all these other groups, to see if there's a way that we can reverse the downward trend of this native species who are outcompeted by the grey squirrels, and to see if there's anything we can do with some of our thinning and habitat management works, and possibly some understory planting to help this species as well. So note here that, as I mentioned, teamwork makes the dream work. Well, it's only really been possible because of the people on the ground who are really doing the work for us and doing the hard work on the ground. And it's been sort of a two-way street, taking the time to educate these guys on what we're doing and why we're doing it, and them in return reciprocating. And for example, calling us up when they find quite a large ant's nest to ask what they should do with it, and then avoiding it with their machinery. And equally, when they saw a little small rodent running out of this nest in one of the Sitka trees, calling us and said, "I didn't think that dormice were supposed to nest naturally in the commercial plantation." And that's led on to a whole host of other questions. Are they actually nesting in the Sitka spruce? So also the grazers, which are a really key part of this story. So we have belted Galloways, Welsh Blacks, and Highland cattle who are all grazing the site for us, will do for the lifetime of the wind farm. And their, obviously, well-being is of utmost importance to us, that we take care of these young ladies who are doing the hard work, really, at the end of the day. And finally, our HMP stakeholder group we have everybody from RWE to the local planning authorities, Natural Resources Wales, our volunteers, our academics. Everybody meets on site in the forest for a cuppa and a cake to discuss the monitoring results and to determine, is what we're doing working? Are we going in the right direction, the direction nature wants to go? Is there anything we have to do differently, which we have done? And it's been a really positive experience, lots of positive feedback from our regulators. Recently, one who told me, "We didn't think you guys would accomplish this with all the challenges around this busy forest." But we recently had one of the Welsh ministers on site, and I was able to speak to him directly about peatland restoration and how wind energy and biodiversity conservation can work together to try to inform Welsh policy. So thank you so much for your interest, and I hope you agree when you look at this picture of dawn over Clocainag Forest. It is a very different landscape than it was previously with the wind turbines, but it's also really opened up a lot of opportunities for nature, which we'll continue to monitor, and we really hope will give some incentive and encouragement to other projects out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Very, very positive and interesting presentation, and also very unknown for me. So I think I managed to get one of these challenges from the Scientific Advisory Committee. So thank you very much. And I want to give the floor to Esther. Esther Jones, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we're going to switch over to offshore wind farms now. And I'm Esther Jones. I'm a principal scientist at Biomathematics and Statistics Scotland. And I'm going to talk to you about seabirds and fish distributions and behaviour. So I'm going to talk about the PREPARED project, which is predators and prey around renewable energy developments. It's a long-term research project over 4 years, and it has a lot of project partners in it. It's funded in the UK by the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme and the Crown Estate Scotland. And it's providing insights into the cumulative effects of large-scale wind farms on fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. So this is the first of 2 prepared talks in this session. Ord is going to follow me talking about marine mammals and seabird and fish, and I am going to focus on one aspect of it, which is seabirds and fish in the Firth of Forth in East Scotland. So within this work stream, there's 3 organisations that are sort of like connected together to produce outputs. And the first is Scottish Government Marine Directorate, which are leading fish data collection surveys and analysis to characterise the broad-scale drivers of fish distributions in order to understand ecological drivers and baseline scenarios. They're also quantifying the effects of offshore wind farms on fish distributions to understand fine-scale effects. And then us at BIOS are taking some of these outputs to predict seabird distributions in baseline and offshore wind farm scenarios and properly characterizing uncertainty in both predator distributions and movement models. And then CEH are taking this acquired knowledge from both Marine Directorate and our work at BIOS, and they're using this acquired knowledge to update their environmental impact assessment tool, Seaboard. And this, in turn, will try to reduce uncertainty in environmental impact assessments. So the data collection in this project is fairly unique. We have predators, so the seabirds, which are tagged with GPS tracking devices, so tracking individual animals, and CH are leading the survey work here. And at the same time, we have fish surveys undertaken by Scottish Government that are acoustic and trawl surveys. And these data have been collected between 2022 and 2025. And this means we have this really unique data set of overlapping data for seabirds and fish at comparable spatial and temporal scales. So just talking about the fish data and the outputs of their prey distributions, we have quite a good time series of data from fish surveys. At the top 2 images, you can see the offshore wind farm footprints. So 2 of these, Nantnogirth and Seagreen, have turbines already in place in the water, and some of these are operational. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but there's very small orange triangles sort of within this study area, and these denote demersal stations where we look for gadoids and flatfish. And then for pelagic species, such as sandeel, sprat, and herring, there's dash lines. And these are sort of regular acoustic transects, and they're ground truth by pelagic tows. So modeling broad-scale fish distributions, and in this example, we've got sandeels, but they're modeling quite a large array of fish species. They're using survey data, so historic data and survey data collected and prepared to model this broad-scale distributions, and in this example, it's acoustic surveys. We look at the sand eel data along with environmental variables such as percentage of gravel and bathymetry, and we feed these into species distribution models. They're ensemble generalized additive models and random forest regressions, and depending on the data richness of each species depends on which approach we use. And we look at the relationship between, I don't know why this is, keep going. We look at the relationship between environmental covariates and sand eel abundance. And so the middle graph here shows the percentage of gravel in the substrate, and it peaks around 10 to 15%, which is what you'd expect with sand eels because this aligns with their preference of medium to coarse sand with a small gravel content. And this allows us to make predictions for sand eel in the Forth and Tay. And in the map on the right, you can see there is variation in the sand eel distribution, with red, yellow, and green being higher sand eel abundance, and then the blue and dark blue being lower sand eel abundance. So how will these outputs be used? So the blue arrow on the top shows the modeling process that I've just described. And the prey distributions will firstly act as a baseline scenario with no wind farm effects, and then they're passed on to us at BIOS to model seabird distribution and movements. And secondly, we're able to look at the effects of the environment and wind farm variables and their interactions and see how these may impact fish distributions. Sorry. So going on to matching seabirds and prey, we aim to quantify the different drivers of seabird behavior, movement, and distributions, particularly with respect to prey. And we were investigating how underlying ecological relationships may alter in the presence of wind farms. It's really important to make the link between movement and behavior because relationships between predators and prey depend on behavior. So, for example, when seabirds are foraging, they directly interact with their prey. So we have used hidden Markov models to develop behavioral models. So hidden Markov models take two locations, so two GPS locations on a track, and they look at the temporal difference between those. And then they also look at something called a turning angle, so the orientation differences between those two locations. And different permutations of the distance between the locations and the turning angles between them means that you can derive different behavioral states. And we often sort of associate ecological behaviors with these states. So in the map on the left, it's a kittiwake track, and it's divided into commuting, foraging, and resting. And this allows us to try and associate foraging locations or foraging areas, as well as areas where they're undertaking different behaviors. So we're also determining appropriate spatial temporal scales that drive predator behavior, and also which metrics might be important to characterizing this. We're investigating mismatches in time and space to find out the benefits and limitations of using static broad-scale predictions versus fine-scale prepared ones. So in the graphic on the right here, we've got a static sand hill map with a kittiwake track. The white areas are where we think kittiwakes are foraging. Then we've got the prepared sand hill map, so that's a dynamic map, exactly matching in space and time the kittiwake. And we can see in both of these instances, actually, that the sand hill map shows where there's lots of sand hills where we think there's kittiwakes foraging. But on at the bottom image is where we think a kittiwake is foraging. And with the static map, it shows that there's no sand hills. But with the prepared data, we can see that there is actually sand hills there. So it just shows that spatiotemporal matching is really, really important to be able to characterize behavior. So we've developed species distribution maps for seabirds as well. We've estimated the changing relationship between prey density, seabird density, and uncertainty, and we're also accounting for wind farm effects. So the outputs from this spatial modeling is a series of maps and full uncertainty quantified both through prey and propagated through to predators. And we're also examining transferability of these models to other regions where prey may be limited. And we're developing a how-to open access guide, so it's really transparent how we've done the modeling and how we've made our assumptions and limitations, and that's followed up by a peer-reviewed paper as well. So we're aiming to improve environmental impact assessment tools through prey maps and movement distribution models. And then CEH are taking these to improve their seaboard model. Seaboard is a mechanistic individual-based model used to simulate displacement and barrier effects for 4 species of seabirds around the UK, so puffins, guillemots, razorbills, and kittiwake. And it incorporates different processes seen in the conceptual diagram, which represent relevant behaviors required to predict population level effects resulting from a proposed offshore wind farm development. They're looking at making tracks more realistic and using a bias-correlated random walk to incorporate different movement modes, which gives individuals the ability to interact with their environment and exhibit foraging decisions in relation to the constraints that they're up against. So in conclusion, the Marine Directorate are using distributions of prey in relation to key environmental drivers to understand the impacts of offshore renewables. We're using seabird movement and distribution models and how that responds to offshore wind farms and prey. And then CEH are updating their model for more realistic tracks for interacting with prey and offshore wind farms. And in conclusion, what this delivers is improved confidence in environmental impact assessments by increasing biological realism and validating tool mechanisms, and also an improved application of tools into new regions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed as well. And now I give the floor to Aude Benema-Legol.
Hi, my name is Aude Benema-Legol. I'm a postdoc at the University of Aberdeen Lighthouse Field Station, and today I will talk about some work we've done also as part of the Prepared project on marine mammal response to disturbance at an operational offshore wind farm site. So in the UK, the offshore wind energy sector is expanding rapidly, so there is a need to better understand the ecological effects of offshore wind farm clusters on protected marine species. And for marine mammals, most of the concern has been is associated with the construction phase due to the increase in underwater noise levels in the, during pile driving activities and vessel traffic. While during the operation phase, the impact is expected to be much smaller, but over an extended period of time. On one hand, the vessel traffic associated with operation and maintenance activities can temporarily disturb animals. But on the other hand, the introduction of man-made structures can provide pre-aggregation and therefore enhance marine foraging opportunities for marine top predators. So the key objective of this study was first to characterize vessel traffic during operation and maintenance activities at an operational offshore wind farm site. And the second objective was to assess the extent of harbor porpoise behavioral response following the close approach of service vessel and investigate whether habitat quality or prey availability may mediate this level of response. So the study area is located 15 kilometers offshore in the Outer Moray Firth in northeast of Scotland, where the Beatrice, the Moray East, and the Moray West offshore wind farm have been built over the last 8 years. In this study, I will only focus on the Beatrice offshore wind farm, which is composed of 86 jacket foundations, which were 5 years old at the time of the study. Over the summer of 2022, a large array of echolocation click detectors, also called CPODs, were deployed at the Beatrice offshore wind farm. Half of the array was deployed within 60 meters of the jacket foundation, and were called pod at turbine. The other half of the array was deployed around 500 meters of the jacket foundation and were called midpoint pods. And so to monitor harbor porpoise occurrence, we looked at the detection of regular echolocation click trains, and we used buzzes as a proxy for foraging activity. During the summer months, one of the key prey species for porpoises is a lesser sandeel. So to have a better understanding of the potential prey availability at this site, we use the Langton sandeel distribution map of the North Sea, and we extracted predicted values of the sandeel occurrence for each monitoring site. We also use AIS vessel tracking data to characterize the vessel traffic at operational wind farm site. So for this study, we only focused on the 4 service vessels, 3 crew transfer vessels, and 1 vessel used for research. So they were multi-cats and had an average speed of between 3 to 4 knots within the wind farm site. During the study period, they were there 7 days a week between 6 a.m. and 5 p.m. And so what you can see in this animation is tracks of 3 service vessels, over 1 working day. And so the crew transfer vessel would just transfer the crew or equipment at a jacket foundation and then remain local. And you can see the yellow flash as a porpoise detection at our monitoring site. And basically, porpoises were detected across pretty much the whole wind farm site throughout the day. And now if we're looking at porpoise occurrence throughout our study period, porpoise were detected every day between 8 to 18 hours a day. And the red ticks you see at the bottom of the timeline represent the days during which a service vessel passed within 500 meters of our monitoring site. And so if we just focus on one close approach, for instance, we wanted to know how long it would take for porpoises to come back to a site following the departure of a service vessel. So we estimated the time to the first porpoise click train or buzz detection, and this metric was used as a response variable in our model. So the covariates we used, it was either a pod at turbine and midpoint pod. We also summarized the vessel intensity within 2 kilometers of our monitoring sites. We distinguished between a vessel transiting or a vessel at turbine. We also summarized the median buzz positive hour per day for each monitoring site to have a better understanding of the overall porpoise foraging activity, and use the probability of single occurrence for each monitoring site. We ran a generalized linear mixed effect model with a negative binomial distribution. So for the harbor porpoise occurrence model, there were 2 covariates that was returned in the model. It was the pod location and the vessel activity type. So following the departure of a vessel transiting, the time to the first click train was significantly higher at a midpoint pod in comparison to pod structure, which suggests that porpoise may come back faster to this area closer to the jacket foundation. Now, if we just look at the pod structure, the time to the first click train was significantly higher following the departure of a vessel that was at a turbine in comparison to a vessel that was just transiting. If we're now looking at the porpoise foraging activity model, the median buzz positive hour per day was the only covariate return in the model, and the time to the first buzz significantly decreased in areas with higher foraging activity. And these areas of higher foraging activity was partly linked with higher probability of single occurrence in this area. So if we summarize now our findings, following a close approach of a service vessel, the extent of porpoise response varied with the type of activity the vessel was engaged in, but also the overall habitat quality. So following the departure of a vessel transiting, porpoise come back faster to site in close proximity of a jacket foundation. And this can be due to the pre-aggregation around this jacket foundation. So a recently published study by Tony Bicknell and his colleagues at the University of Exeter have found there was an increase in demersal fish species at the Beatrice Jacket Foundation during the same study period as the one I used. So it's possible that porpoises come back faster to area with more predictable pre-aggregation. It's also possible that porpoises use a foundation as a shelter, as they may be less frequently exposed to disturbance or vessel traffic. However, porpoise took longer to come back to site to site at turbine when the vessel was left the turbine in comparison to a vessel just transiting. So and this could be due to the difference in the level and duration of disturbance between a vessel that is just transiting and a vessel that stopped and pushed against a turbine to transfer equipment or crew, for instance. And we also found that the level of porpoise response was mediated in area with higher foraging activity. So this study showed the short-term disturbance of vessel traffic at an operational wind farm site. It will be now interesting to know whether this level of response are similar in neighboring wind farms to better understand the long-term cumulative effects of commissioned wind farm clusters. We also need to better understand the acoustic signature and footprint of this service vessel to assess the level of vessel noise porpoise may be exposed to, and also help inform vessel management at these commission sites. And finally, we still need to understand how pre-availability may change over time at this commission site and the extent to which this will mediate the level of response to disturbance. So if you want to know more about the fish distribution and behavior and nutritional quality at the Moray First Offshore Wind Farm site, I suggest you attend these 2 talks tomorrow. I would like to thank the developers, collaborators, and funders of the Prepared project, the University of Aberdeen Lighthouse Field Station research team, and the skipper Bill Work for deploying and recovering successfully our Moray. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Probably there will be plenty of questions to you as well. And now for the final session of the final presentation of today, it's also about the decommissioning. So also a final stage, I would say. The floor is yours, Pim.
Thank you very much for having me. So I'm Pim Somers from the North Sea Foundation, and I'll be the last talk, so hopefully you're still energized to listen to this last talk just before the dinner. I'll be talking about the nature-friendly decommissioning of offshore wind farms that we mainly work on the policy side of this question. So why decommissioning? Why does it matter for ecology? Why should we talk about this during this conference? Well, as we've heard during the last few days, we all know that the offshore wind expansion is going very rapidly. Also within the North Sea, you have the Ostend Declaration, so we will have 300 gigawatts in 2050. This will also mean that there will be a huge wave of end-of-life turbines approaching. As you can see in the graph below, you can see for the southern North Sea that there will be a huge increase in the amount of turbines that need to be decommissioned in the relatively near future already. But actually, regulations on this decommissioning are lagging behind. We have the OSPAR 98.3 decision on disused installation, but this is mainly relevant for oil and gas infrastructure. There's no real regulations yet for renewable energy infrastructure, but most of the national authorities are now also applying this complete removal rule for offshore renewables. Just to illustrate also the amount of materials involved in offshore wind that also need to be decommissioned with full removal, a Belgian wind farm of 45 3-megawatt turbines already accounts for over 240,000 tons of material, of which 80% is scour protection layer, which also falls in the current regulations that need to be decommissioned completely. So the core ecological dilemma is whether to remove or retain parts of the structures, because we also know that there's ecological gains to be had potentially when having these offshore infrastructure. Also with oil and gas, there was an expert judgment study done on how various decommissioning options can contribute to achieving our environmental objectives. And this expert judgment also shows, well, the dotted line right of the dotted line is working towards achieving these ecological goals, these environmental goals in regulations. And left of the dotted line means that it will not help, it will move away from achieving those targets. And these experts, well, it was for oil and gas, but they clearly, you can see that for total removal, we will more likely move away from achieving our targets than repurposing or partial removal. So wind farms as ecological habitats, we all know that the seas are very in a degraded state, also the North Sea, as was also published in the most recent OSPA quality status report in 2023. And as we've heard all these days, well, offshore wind farms, we have evidence that there are artificial reef effects and that it attracts biodiversity. It changes ecosystem functioning, it increases food availability, it provides shelter. So it has a huge impact on the local ecosystem, not always something that we want to achieve, not always biodiversity that is actually valuable, but it definitely does attract a lot of life. But we're also now trying to attract certain life by nature-inclusive designs, which are also by regulations promoted through the implication of non-price ecological tender criteria, which were also done in recent Dutch tenders. But also these nature-inclusive design measures now currently fall within these regulation of total removal after at the end of life. So offshore wind farms are not just infrastructure, but they can actually also build ecological value. So partial decommissioning could be a way for the very specific cases where we have created biodiversity, ecological communities that are really valuable. Partial decommissioning should be an option to be considered. And that's where we are working on in a Dutch collaboration. So it's a project, a nature-friendly decommissioning project. We do it together with oil and gas industry. So that's represented by Element.nl, Next Step, and EBN. EBN is the Dutch government participant in oil and gas projects. Together also with the wind industry, with TenneT, TSO, and with Net Zero, the Dutch Wind Energy Association. And also together with other NGO, Natuur en Milieu, the North Sea Foundation is working together to achieve the goal of working towards evidence-based criteria on whether to retain or remove certain structures. And we don't have the science in-house, so these creation of these criteria are mainly to also start the discussions in policy. So these criteria will not be perfect yet, but it helps us to go have discussions with the Dutch government, but also internationally. Discussions are starting within OSPA. A task force is now starting up in October, and they will hopefully get to a decision in 2027. So it's a very relevant discussion, and we want to have criteria for whether there's ecological value or not, and whether you should retain it or not. And these ecological criteria are mainly built up out of three different main criteria groups. So on biodiversity, so things as species, richness, abundance, so very general biodiversity data that we need in order to assess what kind of communities have been growing on these structures, but mainly focusing on the lower parts in the scour protection layer for the partial decommissioning. And then we also look at the policy relevant species in order to have this discussion with the policymakers. We're also trying to include functional diversity in order to also include more ecosystem functioning and the broader value for the broader ecosystem. And that's also where the community similarity comes in. We know that there is limited overlap between artificial reefs and natural reef communities, but a bigger overlap between them would be beneficial in order to create ecological value and show value for the broader ecosystem beyond the wind turbines and the oil and gas platforms. So we currently just have a list of criteria, but we're trying to work towards, on the right, work towards more prioritized decision tree, but this is still very much in the works. In order to test our preliminary criteria, we also did a case study. It was performed by Valentijn Elsman. He used data from Belgian wind farms, but also in the Netherlands from Princess Amalia, and the only hard substrate natural reef in the Netherlands. And from his, I only show here the community similarity comparison, and you can see that there were 135 taxa found on the scour protection layers of the different wind farms, but only 22, so 16% of these taxa also occurred in the Borkum reef ground, so in a natural reef. And that can also be seen in the non-metric multidimensional scaling plot, that in red the natural reef is clearly dissimilar. But still, we think there's potential. So we know that the data is very limited. So that's really also limiting in the decision on potential partial decommissioning. We need more data in order to really substantiate the choice that there is ecological value to be protected. But there's also, we see that the comparison with natural reefs, well, in this case, there was only one natural reef, so in also a distinct area that is really other ecosystem functioning than the location where the wind farms are. So we will also be looking at alternative comparisons there. But we still think that our framework has potential and is a good basis for discussions with policymakers. But we need more data and smarter monitoring for that. It goes beyond ecology, of course, the decommissioning question. There's also a very important aspect of circularity. And we need also to look at other users such as shipping, fisheries, and aggregate mining and military. So that's also things that we will be looking at in this project, but that is not really my focus within the project. And we also try to link it to to legal contexts such as the EU Nature Restoration Law, the updates of national marine spatial plans, but also these OSPAR discussions that are happening. So we need to move forward and need to be adaptive, and we really think that we should not have a black and white decision on decommissioning, but really have a case-by-case support to look at the ecological value to be had. And just to finish up, I have a short clip of, this is separate from another study, from another collaboration that we did with Natuur en Milieu Renewables Grid Initiative and BirdLife International. And it shows a bit of our, how we see decommissioning and end of life, our vision, how we think it should be done. There's no sound, but there is subtitles.
If structures have improved the area's ecological value, partial decommissioning of the wind farm is an option. In the case of total decommissioning, reusing as many materials as possible can reduce the amount of new raw materials needed in the future. Nature is the foundation of all of the services the sea offers us. Our energy transition must go hand in hand with protecting and strengthening nature. That's the only way to bring balance to the North Sea and together ensure a sustainable future. Do you want to know more about our vision for nature-friendly offshore wind farms? Visit this website.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all presenters for the excellent presentations so late on this day. And I want to invite you back to the stage, please. And I want to ask the audience if you have questions to one of these presenters.
Hi. This is for Kristen. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting to see the amount of restoration work that has gone in. I'm here. And I was just wondering, I had two short questions. One is, for the heathland restoration, I think most public's gut instinct when they see trees being cut down is that it's a bad thing. So I was wondering what reaction you'd had from the public and how you had kind of been able to manage that and educate, I guess. And my second question is on species reintroduction and whether you've considered reintroducing any other species like pine martens, for example, in that area.
A very good question, yes. I think one of the biggest challenges initially was to help the local community and all our stakeholders appreciate that we were not the big bad developer that was just going to come in and not think about what we were doing and just fall words on a page rather than action that actually meant something for nature. So it has been a challenge, but I think we've been able to demonstrate through our monitoring outputs a level of biodiversity and positive indicator species on the heathland compared to the Sitka spruce next door. And if we were to let that natural regen grow up, it's even thicker than the planting ratio for the conifer plantation itself. So the other interesting thing is it's quite peaty soil, even though it's not classified as a peatland, it's quite peaty soil. And there's, in the literature, there's actually evidence that when we plant trees on peat, we're actually, despite the capture of carbon by the trees, it's still a net source of carbon. So there's actually some evidence as well from a climate change perspective, what we're doing for the ecosystem there, not just the species that will use this heathland habitat. So, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your second question now. Oh, yes. Pine marten's a good one. I've spoken to someone from the Vincent Wildlife Trust who's done some pine marten releases across the UK. We have collaborated on a pine marten release, actually, and pine marten monitoring on one of our other sites in Wales, where the population has increased as a result of some of our work and den boxes that we've put out. And he thinks that there probably are pine marten in Clochainog Forest. We just haven't found them yet. So we haven't done any active releases. We're not against it, obviously. Very keen to collaborate, but he thinks we just need to give nature a bit of time with the helping hand we've given it, and some of these species will come back. So it's quite early days, as I've said. We've just completed our restoration project, but hopefully over the coming years we'll see some more activity there.
Sure. Hey. In the interim, oh, sorry, they told me to ask the question, Kai. I'll ask the question and then you'll have your microphone turned on. Hi, Pim. Thanks for your presentation, very interesting. Raises some interesting questions because you show a turbine being partially removed, leaving parts sticking out of the seafloor, which developers may be enthusiastic about if they provided they can transfer liability to the national governments. And that brings me to my actual question. So you're suggesting a case-by-case evaluation, which will take place rather late in the process. Is this something that developers are waiting for, or do they want to have this settled so they can plan before it?
Yeah, so we want to have an area-based approach, because also we've been talking with the Dutch ministries, and they are also not very keen on having this last-minute assessment and having all these case-by-case approaches, having dots all around the North Sea, which is very hard to manage. So we're looking into an area-based approach in which we, that's also how we want to link it more to things like the nature restoration law. So really look into what are areas that have high potential for, ecological value to be, to develop on these structures, and only within those areas, apply this case-by-case approach, and outside of these areas, the standard will still remain complete removal. And also with, we haven't defined these areas yet, and that's a very difficult task. So I'm not sure if we will be able to, but that will, on the one hand, make it more manageable for policymakers, and but also from an ecological side, it makes sense, because then for the connectivity of leaving parts behind, then at least they're somewhat in the vicinity of each other. So that might be beneficial as well. And for parts taking out of the seabed, we think that also from literature that the most potential is to retain only the scour protection layer and get as much steel out as possible. But that's really also a technical question that we haven't looked into that much, because we really are focusing now on this policy side of the discussion, and haven't really went deep into the technological side within this project yet.
So now I think you can hear me. I had a question regarding the mortality and the bat counts in different projects in France. Have you looked at the contribution or the variation between different turbine models, turbine ages, or looked at the characteristics or settings or options? Because below cut-in, there are different options for how the turbines could be configured. So is that a variable that has been considered?
You mean about the curtailment? The cut-in speed, or?
There's a curtailment dictated by the SCADA system, but there's also an inherent characteristics of the turbines that varies between models and brands.
No, I didn't use brands as a explanatory variable. I didn't test that. Only a characteristic from the what I presented. And for the curtailment, I only that there's a lot of different characteristics, so we're still working on it to try to see if there is some different cutting speed which are more effective to reduce mortality. But for what I presented, it's just if at least one of the turbine have been curtailed during the process.
Okay.
Hi, Kristen. This is Glenn from Scottish Power Renewables. I'm here. I'm really interested in your use of grazing on the site. So it's not something that happens too often on wind farm habitat management plans because of some of the difficulties involved in getting them on site. So I've got questions about logistics, and presuming that this was an ungrazed site to start with, how did you deal with fencing and water and stock checking, things like that? And then how is the monitoring been designed to track the effect that they're having on the vegetation?
Yes, so you're right. There was nothing in place really for the cattle. So that's been a huge logistical challenge to first restore the land and then put in our fencing. And we've had to actually dig some ponds so the cattle have a source of drinking water. But obviously that's been embraced as well, because there are very few ponds on the site, and you know, they're full of amphibians come the spring. So it's been logistically very challenging to actually get the infrastructure in for these cattle to graze. We did want to look at collarless grazing as well, but that was a step too far for NRW. They weren't keen on that, and the risk that they'd have cows running wild that they'd be chasing after. So we had to go with fencing and putting in the ponds for them as well.
And then the monitoring.
Yeah, and the monitoring, so we do have a robust program of monitoring in place, vegetation monitoring, to look at using positive indicator species and line transects annually through these areas to look at how well the habitat's developing towards sort of a target habitat and target species that we anticipate developing in those areas. So we are monitoring it year on year and looking at those monitoring results every year with our consultants at SLR and our stakeholder group to determine if it's going in the right direction. And to be honest, so far the cattle are doing a much better job than one small area where it's too small to fence and we have to mechanically flail it, cut it, and the cattle are by far outperforming our mechanical methods. So.
Hi, there we are, it's working again now. Sorry, Kristen, another question for you. Incidentally, on Pine Marten at Clocainog, I expect they are present because they were two at the adjacent forest, one of which it was identified on bib patterning, was found more than 100 miles away afterwards, dead on the side of a road, the inference being it was taken there by car. Either it stowed a ride, I expect that's the case. But you mentioned that there's been some changes along the way in the habitat management plan for Clocainog. Is that a result of failed measures or measures that you thought could work slightly better, so adjusted?
Absolutely. I would say it's more the latter, that we've tried to go at this with an adaptive approach, that yes, there's a big, great plan for the site, but nature may want to go in a different direction once the wind farm's built and once we've cleared some of these areas. So it's been more trying to embrace what we're getting back and to give it, a bit of support. So that woodland, like I mentioned, that's a complete change. That was meant to all be felled. And we looked at it, and it was one of our local planning ecologists who said, why would you guys take this down? This is a really nice piece of woodland. So, and NRW, in the end, has actually adopted that into their forest resource plan, and it's benefited them, actually, in their targets as well for the forest. So it's been more just trying to, one step at a time, and learn as we go, and try to be dynamic with our approach to what's naturally happening there.
So we have to nearly finish this session. So there are 2 questions here, the 2 last ones. So you're lucky. And I'm pretty sure that we will meet and have a lot of questions after this. But go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much. All were great talks. I have a question for the 2 talks about prey fields. So those are excellent. Thank you so much. Esther, you mentioned at the end, interest in translating the knowledge you gained about forage fishes to other locations and what that looked like. I'm curious what your considerations are for that process and how you think about transferring knowledge from the sites you know a lot about to the sites you know not a lot about. And I guess the same question I think I would apply to the other talk too. Have you thought about how to transfer what you've learned there to another location?
So transferability in prepared is actually a separate work stream, so it's a really core theme of prepared. And in the seabird and fish work stream, we're doing it in a few ways. I guess directly, it's through Seaboard, which I talked about at the end, which CEH are updating, and they're doing that in a number of ways. One of them is updating that through new prey maps, and then testing transferability by applying it to a special protected area in England to check transferability of the modelling and the relationships that are within that model. Another way that we're doing it is that there is currently a static standill map, which Ord presented in her work. It's usually referred to as the Langton map. And that is an aggregation of about 10 years of data. So it's very detailed in terms of, it's very broad scale around the UK, but it doesn't have a temporal aspect. And one of the things that BIOS is doing is trying to vary that map by including uncertainty, including temporal trends over time, using some ICES data, and also finding ways to include the prey maps that we have in prepared, so where we have detailed information of prey, using those maps, and then incorporating that into a wider map, so aggregating it with the Langton map and the fine-scale prepared maps, so you have one continuous surface, so you can switch between detailed maps where you have it, and less, more broad-scale maps where you don't have that fine-scale detail. And that's really important with the prey fields because there are places around the UK where seabirds are tagged in quite a few different locations, and it's really the underlying prey data where we don't have. So a lot of the modelling in prepared is testing. Okay, so we've got this really good data in the Firth of Forth, and we've got really good prey data, really good predator data, but how do you then translate those models and how do you make them transferable to the rest of the UK or at least North Sea?
Yeah, I think Esther answered well the question. So for the prey in the Murray Firth, so I personally use a Langton cell distribution map, but there is also other work done with Brev, looking at different prey biomass around the turbine foundation and outside, further away from turbine foundation and outside the wind farm sites to better understand the extent of the reef effect, and that's something that Tony Bicknell is going to present tomorrow. There is also some work done looking at tracking fish and see the connectivity and residency within the wind farms. And in terms of trying to link porpoise with prey, with that static map, you could basically reproduce what I did in that wind farm in other wind farm sites. You just need some AS data and porpoise data, but yeah, it's possible to do that, not only on wind farm, but also around port, or yeah, the principle can be applied in other type of study.
I've got a question for Ord. I'm here. I wondered if in your data and your array of hydrophones, whether you see evidence that they are displaced from an individual hydrophone by a boat being present, but actually they're just going to another turbine where there's a hydrophone, and you can see that movement within your array. And then building on that, I was wondering, as an expert in this species, whether you think there are long-term effects from the displacement that you're seeing.
So with passive acoustic monitoring, we can't really say we can't track individuals with seapods. You can do that with other type of hydrophone, with triangulating their position, but with the type of array I use, you can't really track an individual. So the way I look at it is detection of porpoises as a population more than individuals. You could look at distance, change in occurrence with distance from vessel, and see if there is more occurrence at the turbine, but you couldn't say if it's this porpoise that went to the next turbine. But yeah, and the long term, well, I try to emphasize the fact that porpoise are detected pretty much all the time in that wind farm. So although there might be some short-term disturbance, I can't really say if there would be a long-term response. There is also two other wind farms that now are operational nearby. In 2022, there was the Moray West wind farm that wasn't built yet, and we had also some pods at that reference site, and there were more detection of porpoises in the reference site than in that wind farm. But yeah, it's something I can't really answer this very well.
Well, thank you all, the audience, and of course the presenters. Thank you very much.